Ori and the Will of the Wisps is due to come out very soon. In fact, there's a very good chance that it will already be out by the time this video gets published, and it seems to be getting quite a lot of attention. Many people whose opinions I respect are looking forward to it a great deal, thanks largely to their experiences with the first game in the series, Ori and the Blind Forest, which came out almost exactly 5 years ago. Of course, I'd seen and heard quite a bit about that first game. It has a remarkably gorgeous art style that is hard to ignore, but I'd never actually played it. Now, seeing how excited people are for the imminent arrival of the sequel, I figured the time was right to squeeze it into my schedule and see what I make of it. Oh, I think this is the first game I've covered that warrants a spoiler warning. The story elements in The Blind Forest are relatively minimalist, but they do have a certain weight and emotional impact, so if you intend to play this game and really prefer to go in blind, maybe skip this video for now. And actually, possibly the most emotionally impactful moments of all take place right at the start, so if you're going to skip it, now's the time. The game begins with a brief prologue, and honestly I'm hard pressed to think of any platformer, or any game at all really, that starts with such profound and self-assured beauty. The visuals, the music, what can I say? Words are insufficient. For most of this prologue, you actually control Naru, a rotund, motherly creature who takes Ori into her care. Again, the storytelling is minimalist, but nevertheless, within a few short minutes, we see an incredibly strong bond form between the two. And then, in a similarly brief span of time, but with even more emotional impact, we see the spirit tree call out to Ori, and the subsequent cataclysm fall over the forest, with tragic consequences. Finally, we see Ori on the brink of death. But we see too the birth of hope. I've never been particularly interested in the debate over whether video games are an art form. For one thing, I've always been pretty happy to consider them art. For another thing, art itself is something which is almost futile to try to define. But I'm not sure there's any definition of the word in which this moment does not count as art. It's sublimely beautiful and perfectly evocative. I don't mind admitting I had tears in my eyes at this point. And perhaps more importantly, I was now eager to see how the rest of the game would play out. And indeed, this is where the game starts in earnest. You now have control over the small but nimble Ori, And like all good games of this type, you're guided through the basic controls and gameplay fundamentals. The most important of these is probably the concept of energy, a secondary resource that fuels some special moves, but also, crucially, allows the creation of save points almost anywhere. Death comes thick and fast at many points in this game, so the ability to create a checkpoint is rather handy. Before long you meet Sane, a glowing ball of light that describes itself as the light and eyes of the spirit tree, and who from this point on will serve as both your guide and your primary form of offense. Tapping the X button causes Sane to send out bolts of energy that seek out and damage nearby enemies. And I guess now is as good a time as any to get out of the way my one significant criticism of Ori and the Blind Forest. The combat isn't great. This is largely due to the enemy design, as the enemies more often act as annoying hindrances rather than compelling challenges. At best they represent a delay of a few seconds as you eliminate them, at worst they interrupt truly enjoyable platform sequences by randomly hitting you with a projectile and knocking you off a ledge. It's not a huge issue. There was certainly no point at which I felt majorly frustrated. There were just quite a few points at which I felt mildly irked. Anyway, with Sane in tow, your task is now to find the Spirit Tree, which is the source of light and life in the forest, and from which Ori was torn away long ago. And from here on, the game is essentially a Metroidvania-style journey through a world of branching paths, locked doors and corresponding switches, environmental hazards, and platforming challenges. And as you can perhaps tell, it's also a world of astonishing beauty. One of the artist's biggest inspirations was the films of Hayao Miyazaki. Indeed, one of the areas is even named Valley of the Wind, which any anime fan will instantly recognise. And while the art style in Ori and the Blind Forest is not necessarily similar to Miyazaki's style, the appreciation or the reverence of the natural world is very much the same. That said, the early parts of Ori's journey take you through a natural world that is in decline. There is still beauty here, no doubt, but the colours are mostly subdued, and many of the plants seem to be dead or dying. Around this time, though, you'll come across one tree that seems to still harbour the remnants of life, or if not life, then the memory of life. These trees, scattered throughout the world, serve as ability unlocks. Each one you find will grant you a new ability, which in turn will allow you to access more areas and find hidden upgrades and items. This first one gives you the ability to wall jump, a fundamental and rather vital ability in just about any platformer these days. Speaking of upgrades, there are a few different ways to make life easier for Ori. Specific items can be found to increase your maximum health and energy, both of which are, naturally, very handy indeed. Killing enemies and finding other specific items also grant you spirit points, which, once you've accumulated enough of them, will grant you an ability point. These can be spent in the game's version of a talent tree. There are 3 branches, which enhance, broadly speaking, Ori's abilities in combat, exploration, and mobility. You can choose to specialise in one or spread your points evenly. I chose the latter option, just going for the abilities that seem most useful at any given time, and that seemed to work out well enough. You can also find an item that uncovers segments of your map, which as you can probably imagine is very handy for finding items and upgrades tucked away in hard to reach places. Anyway, before too long you arrive at the Great Spirit Tree, which lies dormant and still. Now, you get to see the cause of the blight spreading through the land. The great owl Kuro came and took the core of the spirit tree, crushed it, and cast it into the depths of the forest. That core, it transpires, was Sane, the spirit that now accompanies Ori. And now, Sane tells you, the 3 elements of light that the spirit tree once sustained need to be brought back into balance, and it's up to Ori to undertake this quest. As overarching video game quests go, it's not particularly original or sophisticated, but it really doesn't have to be. This is not a game that would benefit from being more complex or more explicit in its story. The world is like a vast painting, and it's fitting that the story and motivating quest are likewise impressionistic. So then, Ori sets off to find the element of water, which sits atop the giant Ginso tree. The path forward is still rather bleak and unfriendly, taking you through environments filled with spiders and thorns, and water that is too toxic to be safe. If you're observant, you may notice you're being watched by a shadowy presence. You might also get some serious Golem vibes. You might be reminded of Golem even more strongly when you see that it's taken something precious from you. Before you can even access the Ginso tree, you must recover the item this creature, known as Gumo, has stolen. Not an easy task, as he leads you on a perilous chase through the swampy depths of an area that is greener and more alive than those you've seen so far, but also filled with poison and danger. The chase takes you into a cavern filled with luminous mushrooms and flowing water, and yes, it's yet another gorgeously rendered environment. The colours are muted for the most part, subdued greens and blues and oranges, which serves to enhance by contrast the splashes of brighter colour that are scattered here and there. Eventually Gumo becomes trapped under a rock fall of his own making, and you're able to catch up to him. But of course Ori is a benevolent spirit, and so you free the poor bedraggled creature, which ignites within him a spark of hope. He hands over the item you need, and retreats, for now. Time then to enter the Ginso tree and find the element of water. This environment, along with the resting places of the other two elements, are probably best thought of as something vaguely similar to the dungeons in a Zelda game. They're self-contained areas and somewhat more linear than the outside world, and consist mainly of challenging traversal and some light puzzle elements. For instance, this puzzle requires you to position objects in order to divert an enemy's projectile through a series of portals so that it destroys a door that blocks your way. It's not exactly rocket surgery, but it's enough to get the grey matter firing and slow down the action just long enough to let you take in the splendour of the art and the music. If they were poorly designed, these dungeons could be considered unwelcome diversions from the main open environment, but actually they're very well designed indeed, and contain some of my favourite parts of the game. They're deliberately set out to require the full use of all the abilities you've unlocked to that point, and it's great fun to figure out just how nimble and mobile Ori can be. There's also some seriously challenging rooms packed into these dungeons, and I'm not sure you could count all my deaths before the inevitable heat death of the universe, but not once did I ever feel frustrated. The ability to create a save point just about anywhere definitely helps. Creating a save point does use up your energy reserves, so you can't go too nuts with it, but only on a few occasions did I feel pressured to conserve resources. It's another feature of these dungeons that, once you've achieved your goal within them and restored the required element, you're faced with a rather intense escape sequence where you have to get out before you're engulfed by, well, in this case it's water, which makes sense, given that's the element you just restored. Unlike the rest of the game, which, although it may be filled with challenge, can at least be taken at your own pace, these sequences are incredibly high pressure and genuinely exciting. And like just about everything else in this game, they're truly breathtaking in their beauty. This first escape sequence with the water churning below you and bursting through the walls in a stormy tumult may be the best of them. It's truly a highlight of the game. Eventually you're ejected from the top of the tree in a chaotic spout of damp fury, and you're safe. Except, no, you're not. The great Aokuro is watching for you. She casts you down into the darkness and... Dear God, this game has some truly epic moments. But all is not lost. Gumo saves Ori, who is then reunited with Same, and the quest can continue. The next step is to rekindle the element of winds within the forlorn ruins, but first you need to acquire a key to open their gates, so better get to it. With the element of water restored, the rivers of the forest have been brought back to their natural purity, and Ori is now free to swim beneath the surface. You can't do this for too long though. Until you're able to unlock the ability to breathe underwater, Ori needs to surface for air after only a rather short interval. Apart from that though, you can move about underwater with just as much speed and agility as you can on land. There's no irritating slowdown for the submerged sections of this game. I'm looking at you, Sonic. You have more movement abilities now, and the environments get correspondingly more complex to accommodate them. Possibly the most important new ability, and maybe the most important and impactful ability in the entire game, is the way you can use enemy projectiles as a boost when jumping. So long as you can get close enough to one, you can hold down the Y button, which briefly slows time to a crawl, then adjust your trajectory and let go of the button to shoot off in that direction. Not only that, when you shoot off in one direction, the projectile is propelled in the opposite direction, opening up a heap of new possibilities, such as killing enemies with their own attack, or using their projectiles to destroy obstacles. It's a really interesting ability, and it's implemented nigh on perfectly. Once you get the hang of it, it feels so natural to jump up, boost off one projectile into range of another one, boost off that projectile to get some more height, and then use the double jump to just reach the platform you needed to get to. Add to that the ability to glide, which you acquire during this section, and the possibilities become even richer. Now the misty woods are accessible, and the game takes a turn towards the disconcerting and the disorienting. Your map is disabled in this place, and the world itself wavers and shimmers as if it's not quite real. And strange things seem to happen here. Maybe it's simply because I didn't have access to the map, but I often found myself doubling back and circling around in ways that shouldn't have been physically possible. Whether this is because the game was genuinely messing around with my location, or just because I was disoriented by the lack of a map and the dark, creepy atmosphere, it's testament to the skills of the designers. With that challenge overcome, you can now enter the Forlorn Ruins, which it turns out was once the home to Gumo's people, but is now their icy tomb. Gumo, it seems, is the last of his race. In this second dungeon, the game introduces another quirk. You carry with you a light vessel, which, when activated, surrounds you in a protective shield that allows you to walk over the hot glowing objects without taking damage. But it also seems to mess with gravity itself, allowing you to walk along the walls and ceilings. However, your mobility is severely limited while you're within the shield, as you move slower and can only jump short distances. It's kind of awkward at first. When you're walking on the ceiling, for instance, the controls are reversed. It takes a bit of getting used to, and initially I didn't like this area for that reason, but before too long my mind adjusted, and this actually proved to be another highlight of the game, thanks largely to the novelty of being able to manipulate gravity, at least in as much as it affects Ori. When you're eventually able to rekindle the element of wind, another escape sequence ensues. As water was the theme of the last escape, this time, naturally enough, it's wind. Strong air currents allow you to use your glide ability to rise and fall at will, and avoid the ice and rocks falling down around you. Easier said than done. At last the air currents take you to Kuro's nest, where one lone egg lies in solitary silence. Then we see why Kuro hates Ori and the Spirit Tree so much. This game, man, this game. There are games and books and movies out there that take 100 times as long to create a tenth of the emotion that Ori and the Blind Forest manages. In any case, only one more element remains unkindled. Now you need to find the Sunstone in Sorrow Pass. This is a dry and dusty area, suffused with a gorgeous golden light. Honestly, the word gorgeous is almost unnecessary when talking about this game. If it's in there, it's gorgeous, no exceptions. This is a relatively vertical environment, with traversal made possible by the air currents unleashed by the element of wind, and many of the challenges revolve around the use of the glide ability. And the challenge is picking up. I think it's fair to say that in this game your chief enemy is not any of the monsters that attack you, instead it's the spikes and thorns that cover many of the world's surfaces. Hitting these prickly obstacles always takes away a massive chunk of your health, and increasingly often as the game goes on, contact can actually be an instant kill. And I certainly don't consider this to be a bad thing. I still think the combat is a little underwhelming, but the platforming action is absolutely brilliant, and the best and most compelling challenges come from navigating your way through tight, spike-adorned passageways, knowing that one misstep means your death. With those challenges mastered, you reach the highest peaks of Sorrow Pass, the resting place of the Sunstone. With this in hand, you can open the way to Mount Horu and the final elements. Before that though, you see Gumo approaching the body of Naru, the gentle soul who raised you as her own. He has with him the last artifact of his lost people, and uses it to bring back the spark of life within Naru. And then the two of them set off on their own journey. Ori, meanwhile, enters the volcanic interior of Mount Horu, and if you'll pardon the pun, this mountain is the pinnacle of the game in several ways. This may be the most visually striking area of the entire game. It's stunningly beautiful, but also genuinely oppressive. You can almost feel the heat emanating from the screen, and Ori seems so small and so fragile amidst the smoke and liquid fire. Safe spots here are hard to come by, and many surfaces that you need to walk on will begin to burn you if you maintain contact for more than a second. There is a definite structure to this place. First you need to climb to the highest point, and then enter one of the rooms to either the left or right. Within this room you will face a challenge that, when overcome, will allow you to shut off the lava flow that blocks access to the room below it. Do this for every room on both sides of the mountain's cavernous interior, and the lava will drain from the lower sections, allowing access to the element of warmth. But the challenges within these rooms are also the pinnacle of this game's difficulty. They're undeniably tough, and will require all the dexterity you can muster, along with all the tricks you've learned along the way. In fact, at this point the game turns into something like Super Meat Boy, a series of fiendish platforming sections that will kill you many times, but which you can retry over and over. And I've said before that I don't necessarily relish challenge in video games, but this is the sort of challenge I can appreciate. It's tough, sure, but you learn a little bit more with each attempt, and most importantly in terms of my ADD, you don't have to wait too long after each death. And let's be honest, if I can get through this section without getting too frustrated, just about anyone can. But yes, for me, this is just about the perfect level of challenge, and after a lot of deaths, but also a lot of fun, the lava is drained and the element of warmth can be rekindled. And so it's time for the final escape sequence. This time though, you have more than the reinvigorated elements to contend with. Kuro is here too, a shadowy mass of feathers and hatred that swoops in from the swirling smoke. As you race from the encroaching flames, you also have to contend with her ever-threatening presence, being careful not to stay out in the open too long lest she dive towards you, beak and talons outstretched. This section is another absolute masterpiece of sight and sound. The flames are impossibly vivid, and Kuro's screech as she careens towards you is spine-chilling. Eventually it's over, and I have to let this play out in its entirety. Once again, I have no words. And that's the end of Ori and the Blind Forest, and suffice it to say, I am now really looking forward to playing the sequel, which I should be able to do in a few days at time of writing. So, time for some final thoughts. As you can hopefully tell by now, I liked Ori and the Blind Forest. In fact, I loved it a lot. I'm always slightly wary of games that are acclaimed for their art style. A lot of them seem to think they can get by on their art alone without worrying too much about the actual game. But that's definitely not the case here. The Blind Forest is a fine example of the genre in every way, and the amazing artwork is just the icing on the cake. It just so happens that in this case the icing is amongst the best I've ever tasted, if you'll forgive the somewhat awkward metaphor. Honestly, this is a game that conceivably could have got by on its art alone, even if the rest of the game was crap. But I'm very glad indeed that it's not. That's not to say it's perfect. I don't think any game is. I've mentioned the somewhat underwhelming combat, so I won't go over that again. The only other complaint I have, and this probably shouldn't really be counted as a complaint, is that it's a rather small game. It took me about 6 hours to finish, and if someone like me can do it in 6 hours, I can only imagine how quickly a skillful player would rush through it. Now it needs to be pointed out that in my 6-hour playthrough I missed out on a hell of a lot. I didn't do much searching for secrets, and the definitive edition contains optional areas that I didn't even touch on in this video. And it also needs to be pointed out that the Blind Forest was never a full price game. So on the whole, I think the amount of content is reasonable. But, I don't know, it feels almost blasphemous to criticise a game I enjoyed so much, but I have to say that the overall structure of the game world was a little lacking compared to other Metroidvania style games, even taking into account its price point. Obviously every element within the world was crafted with incredible skill and highly polished, but I never really felt truly enticed to explore more fully, and I never found myself surprised by the way the world opened up around me. As open worlds go, it was competently constructed, but not remarkably so. And the ending does seem a little abrupt. I was expecting, or at least hoping for, a final climactic section once you'd acquired all 3 elements. But this is honestly a minor point, and in fact is more a compliment to the game. I loved it so much I just wish there was more of it to explore and wander through. Will the sequel provide that which I crave? I certainly hope so, and if early indications are anything to go by, I think I'm justified in having my expectations set rather high. Ultimately, just about the highest compliment I can give this game is that it reminds me strongly of the first game I covered on this channel, Echo 2. Of course, Echo is more than a couple of decades older than Ori, and it has a rather different style of gameplay, but both games feature lovingly rendered representations of the natural world and the creatures that inhabit it. They both have an evocative air of melancholy and loneliness to them, and their narratives rely more on sights and sounds than words. They both instill in the player a sense of awe and wonder, and occasionally of unease or even dread. And they're both fundamentally amazing games. Well, thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Maybe throw a like my way or leave a comment if you feel so inclined. And until next time, get off my lawn.